Hello YouTubers, you're on a new episode of The Final Cut, and in honor of the upcoming release of The Mummy on June 9th, I decided to revisit some of the previous Mummy films from Universal Studios. Now in this episode of The Final Cut, I'm going to start with The Mummy from 1932, starring Boris Karloff. Much like I did with the Bela Lugosi Dracula, I'm going to go over a film that's not exactly like the modern day horror film we're used to, but instead something that defined the horror genre as we know it today, something that started the genre that eventually evolved into modern day horror. Now, Universal, of course, in the early 30s is a great time. You had a whole bunch of monster films. You had The Wolfman, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula, Dracula's Daughter, so many films, The Invisible Man, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Phantom of the Opera, just so many films from Universal Studios. And it was also a very, very innovative time in cinema. You finally had sound in cinema. There was no title cards, no orchestras. Everything was being heard on sets in cinema. So it was very different. The movie as we know it today was beginning to evolve, as well as a genre. So real quick is going to be a cast and crew of The Mummy from 1932. Here we go.
The Mummy is a 1932 film directed by Karl Freund. Stars Boris Karloff as Imhotep and Ard F. Bey. Zita Johann as Helen Grosvenor and Anaximandrine. David Manners as Frank Wimple. Arthur Byron as Sir Joseph Wimple, and Edward Van Sloan as Dr. Mueller. The makeup is done by Jack P. Pierce.
So yeah, that's the cast and crew of The Mummy, and it involves Imhotep, which Imhotep actually is a real person. He actually helped build some of the pyramids. He built the first step pyramid, and when he died, he was declared as a god. He became a god, one of the few people who was not a pharaoh, somebody in a high ranking to be awarded such an honor. So that's kind of great that they had a fictional character based on a real person. Also, this is one of the few Universal Studios films that was not based on a novel. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula. There was other material to work for the other monsters, and this was completely original. And part of that is because in 1922, when King Tut's tomb was found, that was a big event, and there was rumors about a curse on the tomb. So that speculated the story. The screenwriter actually worked as a journalist when the tomb was discovered, so that helped aid the story and create The Mummy. And you know, for an original tale, it is not bad. It's actually very innovative. Yeah, I like it. It's Imhotep, and it starts with them discovering his tomb, and he gets awakened through these ancient scrolls. They're red, kind of like the Book of the Dead. The new Mummy from 1999 actually follows the original quite closely, even though they're two totally different movies. But above all, is there blood? Is there scares? No, again, it's not that type of horror film, but much like Dracula, it has that atmosphere, a certain mood about it that's very suspenseful. It's slow, but ultimately, it just has that creepy vibe that can never be replicated, no matter how many guts and gore and language you have or effects. Something about the original Mummy is very mystical in that regard. But Boris Karloff gets a great performance. He was previously Frankenstein years earlier at Universal, and he actually wasn't quite well known at the time. This is like the first movie where he was just known as Karloff, you know, because not many people knew he was the Frankenstein monster. So he plays so many roles in the series. And again, Carl Laemmle Jr. had this series of films he was producing with monsters, so it was quite interesting. And the other actress, Zita Johann, she does a pretty good job. She plays two roles. She's Helen and then Anaximandrine. And pretty much the story is them opening the tomb, they find a mummy, and he's like in this traditional wrapping. And you had makeup artist Jack P. Pierce do the makeup. Now, he used to do makeup for all the Universal monster movies. Very great practical effects that still stand to this day, surprisingly. But they find him, he awakens, and pretty much it's about Imhotep looking for his long-lost love of Helen, and he believes that it's a reincarnation of Anaximandrine, and he basically wants to put her spirit in Helen's body. So that's what it's about, and it's very different in a way. It's not exactly as much of a spectacle like Dracula or Frankenstein. it's much more of a drama piece. It's much more slower. It's more of a romance. And that's what makes it a different type of horror movie. But you still have horror movie conventions. Boris Karloff moves incredibly slow. In a way, it's almost like a prototype for Michael Myers or Jason you would see several decades later. No matter how far you would run, the mummy is going to catch you. And I like it. He's Imhotep, but after he awakens, he starts to heal, and he's just Boris Karloff. He looks a little old. The makeup and the cinematography is just so haunting. Something about black and white and film, it's just so haunting with eyes that just get to me. Photographs, film, they just kind of scare me. Something about it's just, there's something about it that can never be replicated in color, just quite. But I like it. He ends up going under the name Ardeth Bey. Yes, Ardeth Bey was a character in the remake, which is cool because Ardeth Bey is pretty much an anagram for Death by Ra. And Ra is the sun god in Egypt, so that's kind of cool how they did an anagram of Death by Ra for Ardeth Bey. And the other actors do a pretty good job as well. You have Edward Van Sloan, who played the role of Van Helsing in Dracula. He does a pretty good job. And the other actors do quite well, but really it's Zita Johann and Boris Karloff that make this film. They almost have to play two separate roles. You have Boris Karloff as the mummy, as the creature, and then you still have him as a creature, but he's a little bit more of Imhotep when he's under the name of Ardeth Bey. And then you have Zita Johann as Anaxinamen at the end, kind of in a trance before they get her out of it, before they defeat the mummy and burn the scrolls. So ultimately, it's a very basic story, but it has brilliant cinematography. And Carl Freund, that's the director. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure, but he was a German cinematographer before this. He only moved to the U.S. 2 years before, and The Mummy was his first directed movie. So that's kind of a big responsibility from going from cinematographer to having this kind of like larger-than-life spectacle. Even though it was low budget, it was still a pretty big production at that time. And I like the set design. Everything about it feels, again, like a stage play, but it's very minimal, yet they do a lot with the space they're provided. And I like the set designs with the flashbacks in Egypt, just the different type of pharaoh statues and Anubis, and just all around the look and set design of it is very beautiful, very much like The Mummy. You can tell it's a different world in the way they established Dracula's world and Frankenstein's world. This feels like it's in the world of The Mummy, while still having that usual Universal Studios feeling to it. And he actually had a lot of stress. He was going to basically use Zita Johann as a scapegoat, and they had a lot of tension there. But they wound up working through it. And Boris Karloff, he always got dressed up in makeup. And the makeup guy, again, Jack P. Pierce, he's pretty much like the Tom Savini of the 30s. I love his work in all the Universal Studio films. And Boris Karloff's like, this is great, but I just need to have a fly to go to the restroom. And they put him in so much wrapping that it would like peel not only just like some of his face, but like it would be so much that he'd be stiff that he had trouble moving his mouth. So that adds a lot to the challenges, but also what type of caliber of an actor he was performing this. I know there's a lot of makeup, but there's totally different performance between Frankenstein and Imhotep that I just love. That's very, very underrated. Ultimately, The Mummy is not the most scariest film ever made. It can be slow and boring to today's standards, but it's something to be appreciated. And if you're a fan of horror films, if you're a fan of The Mummy, or even just a film aficionado, you do yourself a service by checking this film out, as well as the other Universal Studio Monsters catalog from the 1930s. There's just no other films quite like the Universal Studios films from the 30s. And you can tell that they set up certain rules. They built up and defined the horror genre for it to eventually evolve into what we know today through different tropes and themes. And again, with themes, you also have the mummy and wrapping. That wasn't really a major trope or cliche. That wasn't a set established rule. He's only in there for the beginning, and the rest is just like Boris Karloff with some minimal makeup on his face as Ardeth Bey. So I find that interesting. Overall, I give The Mummy a 3 out of 5, a 7 out of 10, and an A-. Yeah, it's a worthy movie to watch, and you can decide for yourself. The Mummy from 1932 makes the final cut. Besides vampires, I'm a big, big fan and just all-around historian when it comes to Egypt and just Egyptian culture and hieroglyphics and mummies. I just love it. I remember seeing the Brendan Fraser movie. I remember checking this out at Hollywood Video after seeing that, finding out that it was a remake of this film. Remember checking out The Curse of the Mummy and Return of the Mummy's Tomb from Goosebumps. Just all around mummy stuff. Anne Rice's The Mummy. I'm just a fan of Egypt. I just love it. I just love that culture, the pyramids, just everything. Everything about mummies, I just love. But yeah, do yourself a service and check this out. 3 out of 5, 7 out of 10, and an A-. It makes the final cut. Not the best film out of the Universal Studios catalog. I think Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and Dracula are a bit stronger than this one, but this is by no means the worst. It's quite an enjoyable film, and I actually respect it more for the fact that it is a different film. It's not about some of the set pieces. It's not about just the monster. It's really about the tragedy of the monster of Imhotep looking for his lost love. There's a romance tale in the midst of this monster tale that I really, really love. And yeah, the actors do a great job for what they're given. And for a first-time director directing this movie, it is not a bad film. And they would never use Imhotep in the sequels. The next time Imhotep would be used in The Mummy would be the 1999 Brendan Fraser Rachel Weisz remake directed by Stephen Sommers. So it's very interesting to see this film in the 30s and what they could do. You know, they didn't have all the big special effects, the music, giant sets. They didn't have a big budget or technology advances back then, but it's still nice to see what they could do with what they had back then. So I would highly recommend it. Again, that is my review of the 1932 Mummy. Again, if you like this video, feel free to click the like button, comment. If you haven't seen The Mummy, check it out, but comment if you have seen The Mummy. Let me know your thoughts on the 1932 Mummy. What's your favorite Mummy film? And yeah, feel free to subscribe and check out my other videos. I have a Final Cut review of Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. And stay tuned on this channel for I'm going to be having a review of The Mummy and The Mummy Returns on Action Reaction. Thanks for watching and have a great day.